In the fading light of an October evening in the late 1950s, an old man leaned back in a leather chair at his country estate, opened a newly published book, and began to read words that would shatter one of the most important wartime partnerships in British history. Within a few minutes, his brow tightened, his jaw set. The man was Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister of the British Empire, the voice who had rallied a nation against Adolf Hitler. The book was titled The Turn of the Tide, and for the next hour, as pages turned slowly beneath his fingers, Churchill realized something that froze his heart more than any threat faced during the war itself. The words in this book were not merely criticisms, they were confessions. Raw, brutal, unfiltered confessions written by the general who had sat at his side through the darkest days of the Second World War. And by the final page, a friendship that had survived invasion, bombardment, and near defeat was silently buried forever. You are watching WWII Silent Valor, and today we are diving into a hidden story that historians whispered about for decades. The story of how Churchill's most trusted military partner came to betray him with a book that was never meant to exist, and why the consequences were far darker than anyone expected. Before we continue, take a second to tap, like, and subscribe. It takes less than a moment, but it helps this channel grow and keeps deep stories like this alive. If you enjoy historical narratives that go beyond the surface, you are in the right place. Now, let us return to that October night. The book Churchill held carried the name Arthur Bryant on its cover, but the soul of it belonged to another man entirely. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the chief of the Imperial General Staff during the Second World War. Between the years 1941 and 1946, Brooke had been the most powerful soldier in the British Empire. Generals like Montgomery reported to him. Allies like Eisenhower coordinated with him. Even the Soviets negotiated with him. Yet his name rarely appears in popular histories. There are no towering monuments bearing his likeness. And yet, for 5 crucial years, nothing significant happened without crossing his desk. Churchill had once spoken of him with total faith. "I must have Brooke," he would say. "I cannot do without him." And that was true, because while Churchill embodied national spirit, Brooke embodied control, strategy, realism, caution. The two men could not have been more different. Churchill was a romantic, a man of imagination, ready to sketch invasions on napkins at 2 in the morning. Brooke was a scientist of war, a man who saw logistics, manpower, fuel supply, coastline, weather, and enemy capability. Churchill wanted bold strokes. Brooke wanted assured outcomes. Together, they created a balance that allowed Britain not only to survive, but to win. But here, inside the pages of The Turn of the Tide, Churchill was not reading about triumphs. He was reading about himself described as reckless, impulsive, capable of ideas that might have destroyed the nation he swore to defend. He read that Brooke had spent night after night talking him down from disaster, steering him away from impractical invasions and senseless dispersals of forces. He read how American commanders had been baffled by Churchill's schemes, how British generals had whispered behind closed doors about the Prime Minister's exhausting unpredictability. Churchill reached the final page, closed the book with a trembling hand, and understood that the man he had once trusted to manage the war had secretly judged him unfit to manage himself. From that moment forward, Churchill never spoke to Alan Brooke again. No letters, no reconciliation, no final words between two men who had shaped the fate of continents. Their partnership ended not with a command or a death, but with ink on paper. But why did this happen? Why Did the man who served Churchill so loyally decide to publish his private thoughts? Why would a highly decorated field marshal risk his honor, his friendships, his reputation, and even national security just to release these diaries? The real answer is not simple or glamorous. It is far more human and far more tragic. To understand Brooke's decision, we must go back to the final months of the war. The year was 1945. Victory was close. Cities across Britain anticipated banners and marches and newspapers celebrating triumph. Inside the War Office, Brooke was exhausted. He had navigated not only the enemy across the Channel, but the Prime Minister across the hallway. Every major Allied conference, Casablanca, Tehran, Yalta, and finally Potsdam, had seen Brooke sitting at the table, interpreting maps, balancing egos, arguing with Americans, soothing Russians, and restraining Churchill. And yet, as peace arrived, Brooke assumed that he would quietly retire with dignity, respected, financially secure, and remembered. He was wrong. In the year 1946, Brooke left service at the age of 62. His reward for directing Britain's war effort was a pension that sounded impressive, but was rapidly being eaten alive by post-war inflation. The new Labour government had introduced heavy taxation to rebuild the country, and the world Brooke returned to was not the one he had left. The empire was shrinking, the economy was bleeding, and the fortunes of old military families were evaporating. Brooke owned an old family estate in Hampshire called Fernhurst, a symbol of aristocratic continuity stretching back generations. But the estate was crumbling, and Brooke could barely afford to heat it. By the late 1940s, he faced a humiliating choice: sell the estate or declare bankruptcy. He sold it, and the man who had commanded millions of soldiers negotiated with Stalin, debated with Roosevelt, and argued with Churchill moved with his wife not into the big house, but into the gardener's cottage. A small, cold structure meant for staff, not field marshals. In our next part, we will uncover how desperation, fading legacy, and Churchill's rising glory pushed Brooke toward a decision that destroyed everything he had left. So there he was, Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, 1st Viscount Alan Brooke, former Chief of the Imperial General Staff, reduced to a life inside a cramped gardener's cottage on what had once been his own ancestral land. He and his wife Bonita watched strangers walk through gardens that had belonged to the Brooke family for generations. Tourists admired the estate house, whispered about its history, and then drove away. None of them knew that the man who had overseen the British war effort was living just a few yards away, boiling tea in a tiny kitchen, counting coins to cover winter fuel. For Brooke, the humiliation was quiet but absolute. Yet life still had one refuge for him: birds. Since his childhood, Brooke had been an obsessive ornithologist. He could identify species by sound alone. He collected rare natural history volumes with exquisite illustrations of herons, falcons, and owls. He filled notebooks with detailed observations of migration patterns and nesting habits. Even during wartime, when the fate of nations hung on his decisions, Brooke would steal an hour to walk in the woods, binoculars in hand, finding peace in flight, and feathers rather than maps and battle plans. His ornithology library was legendary among enthusiasts. He owned first editions from the 18th century, illustrated works by the great John James Audubon, and priceless natural history atlases that no longer existed in print. They represented a lifetime of collecting, a passion untouched by war, politics, or Churchill's temper. But peace had a cruel way of demanding sacrifices. By the early 1950s, the little cottage needed repairs. Heating costs climbed each winter. His pension remained frozen. His money did not stretch far enough. And so the bird books went too, sold quietly, one by one, to private dealers and collectors who understood their worth, even if the nation did not. A lifetime of beauty, gone to pay bills. Friends who visited Brooke in those days found a man diminished in posture, but not in mind. His wit remained sharp, his memory flawless, his strategic perception undimmed. But his energy had faded. He had once spoken with the authority of a man who held the destiny of the empire in his grasp. Now he spoke softly, as though careful not to disturb the silence of his surroundings. And through it all, he watched his legacy being written by someone else. Because, while Brooke struggled to keep warm in winter, Winston Churchill was becoming one of the wealthiest writers in Britain. In the late 1940s, Churchill published the colossal multi-volume memoir, The Second World War. It became an international phenomenon. His publisher paid advances so large that newspapers printed the numbers in disbelief. His speaking tours brought in small fortunes. By the early 1950s, Churchill's income was so significant that he purchased Chartwell outright, filled it with secretaries and staff, and enjoyed the life of a literary statesman. Then came the crowning glory. In the year 1953, Churchill won the Nobel Prize in Literature, cementing him not only as a political hero, but as a cultural icon. And within those 6 volumes of the Second World War, Churchill did what every great political survivor learns to do. He wrote history with himself at the center. In his telling, he had conceived every major strategic plan, guided every crucial decision, steered every Allied conference, and personally shaped the global war effort. The chiefs of staff became supporting characters. Men like Brooke, who had argued with him for hours, who had blocked his disastrous Balkan adventures, who had preserved British forces through sheer stubborn logic. Those men became background figures. Churchill did not erase Brooke entirely. He simply placed him in the shadows. Brooke bought the volumes. He read them, and each page felt like watching his own life being repainted in someone else's colors. He read the chapters about the Mediterranean, where Churchill claimed the strategic vision that Brooke had championed. He read about Italy, where Churchill emphasized his own insistence, despite having doubted the campaign's feasibility. He read about the arguments over invading Norway, or reopening the Dardanelles, or landing in the Balkans, ideas Brooke had stamped out, now softened, reframed, or omitted entirely. In the memoir's world, Brooke was a loyal executor of Churchill's brilliance. In reality, Brooke had been the brake on Churchill's recklessness. Without him, Britain might have scattered its armies across half a dozen romantic but ruinous fronts. Brooke did not seek glory, but he expected accuracy. And what he read instead was Churchill winning the war alone, while Brooke stood politely in the background, nodding along. This created a pressure inside the field marshal that had nothing to do with money. It was not hunger. It was erasure. By 1955, Alan Brooke was elderly, financially strained, and largely forgotten by the public. Churchill was wealthy, decorated, adored, and still shaping the narrative of the Second World War in lecture halls and newspapers around the world. Younger generations were being shown a version of history in which the Prime Minister had been unchallenged, unopposed, and unrestrained. It was not just inaccurate, it was dangerous, because it suggested that great wars are won by singular giants rather than by entire systems of friction, argument, and compromise. Then came a man named Arthur Bryant, a historian and best-selling author. Bryant approached Brooke in the year 1956 with a proposition. He wanted to publish Brooke's wartime diaries. the raw, nightly writings Brooke had used to vent his frustrations during the war. Bryant argued that the public deserved to know how Allied strategy had really worked, how the chiefs of staff had reined in the Prime Minister, how Britain had been saved not only by Churchill's defiance, but by Brooke's discipline. Bryant promised Brooke two things: recognition and financial rescue. The diaries would show the world that Brooke had not been a supporting character. He had been the architect behind the scenes. History would finally record the partnership as it truly was, not as Churchill wished it to appear. And the publishing income would solve Brooke's financial humiliations. For a man who had lost his home, sold his passions, and watched himself vanish from the official story, the offer was irresistible. So Brooke agreed, and with that single decision, he unknowingly walked into the greatest disaster of his life. The year was 1957, when the edited diaries finally reached the public under the title, The Turn of the Tide. The launch seemed harmless enough at first. It was winter. Britain was still living in the glow of post-war nostalgia. Churchill was not just respected, he was sanctified. Newspapers called him the man who saved the world. School children memorized his speeches. Tourists visited his home at Chartwell like it was a shrine. He was the living embodiment of British victory. So when the book arrived in bookstores, few expected what came next. Readers opened the pages expecting admiration and reflection. Instead, they found Winston Churchill portrayed as impulsive, erratic, and dangerously imaginative. They read diary entries about midnight debates, wild invasion schemes, Balkan adventures that would have bled Britain white. They read how Brooke often had to sit on the Prime Minister. Those were his exact words, to stop him from scattering British forces into every theater at once. They read Brooke describing Churchill as exhausting beyond measure, unbalanced by stress, and nearly impossible to manage during the critical months of the war. These were not the words of a political opponent. They were the private thoughts of the man who had sat at Churchill's right hand for 5 years, the man who had signed off on every British strategy, the man who had directed the war while the Prime Minister rallied the nation with words. The reaction was swift and brutal. The British public considered the book an act of vandalism against a national hero. Members of Parliament condemned it in speeches. Newspapers published editorials demanding how a knight of the realm could dare to tarnish the image of Britain's savior. One prominent paper wrote that Brooke had stabbed Winston in the back for a handful of royalties. The accusation was unfair, but it stuck. In pubs and train stations, people argued about whether the diaries should have been destroyed rather than printed. Book reviewers called it distasteful. Others called it treacherous. Almost no one called it necessary. The military establishment was equally furious. Senior officers who had served in the war believed in silence after service, in loyalty unto death. To them, Brooke had broken the unwritten code of the officer class, never criticized the nation's leaders in public, and never publish private war conversations. What made it worse was the content. It did not just expose Churchill's flaws, it criticized the Americans as well. Brooke had written that General Dwight Eisenhower lacked strategic depth. He had called General George Marshall limited in large-scale thinking. He had questioned American military competence on multiple occasions. These were the diary entries of a man who had believed he would never be read. They were honest, unfiltered, and deeply undiplomatic. But this was 1957. The Cold War was at its height. Britain and the United States depended on each other. They needed unity against the Soviet Union. The idea of publishing diary entries suggesting American wartime leadership was incompetent, horrified diplomats and generals alike. In Washington, Eyebrows were raised and questions were asked. Then came the worst revelation. Some of the edited passages came dangerously close to exposing the existence of Ultra, Britain's top-secret ability to read German encrypted communications during the war. Ultra had shortened the war by years. It was the greatest intelligence secret of the 20th century, and in 1957 it was still classified. Brooke's diaries did not reveal the full system, but they contained enough hints that intelligence officials became deeply alarmed. The government considered suppressing future volumes. The word treason began to circulate in angry whispers, not in the legal sense, but in the moral sense. And through all of this storm, Alan Brooke sat alone in the little cottage on the edge of his former estate, reading the headlines, watching his reputation shatter in real time. But the most devastating blow had not yet landed, because somewhere in Kent, in the quiet countryside at Chartwell, Winston Churchill received his personal copy of the book. Inside, Brooke had written a warm, respectful dedication expressing admiration for Churchill's wartime leadership. It was polite, it was affectionate, and it was earnest. Brooke genuinely believed that Churchill would understand. He believed their shared battle would outweigh whatever harsh thoughts he had once scribbled in exhaustion after midnight arguments. After all, he had never spoken those words aloud. The diaries were private pressure valves, not political weapons. But Churchill opened the book, and Churchill began to read. He read that in the summer of 1944, during the Normandy landings, Brooke had believed the Prime Minister to be in a very dangerous mood. He read that Brooke had found him unbalanced by the strain of office, impossible to control, prone to disastrous ideas. He read entries calling him exhausting beyond endurance, erratic in judgment, obsessed with unnecessary adventures. He read that Brooke had described the war not as a partnership, but as a daily struggle to prevent the Prime Minister from ruining everything through enthusiasm and imagination. When Churchill reached the final pages, something in him snapped shut. Historian Clementine Churchill, Winston's wife, later described Churchill's expression as a mixture of hurt and fury that she had rarely seen in their nearly 50 years together. When Clementine examined the signed dedication at the front and then the content that followed, she uttered the famous line that captured the moment better than any historian ever could. "WWII wants to have it both ways." She was right. Brooke wanted loyalty and revelation, praise and exposure, friendship and honesty. But Churchill saw only betrayal. A few weeks after publication, Brooke spotted Churchill across a crowded room at a London gathering. He approached, perhaps believing that time and shared hardship would smooth over sharp words. The two men drew close. Churchill saw him, and without hesitation, turned his back and walked away. Deliberate, public, final. From that moment, Churchill never spoke to Brooke again. They had spent 5 years shaping the fate of the world, but the friendship died in a single turn of the shoulder. To Churchill, this was not mere criticism. This was an assault on his legacy. And Churchill understood legacy better than any statesman of his generation. He knew that wars are not just fought on battlefields, but in history books. And the Second War, the war for memory, had just begun. Alan Brooke would lose that war. In the years that followed the storm of 1957, the world moved on, and so did history. Churchill continued to shape the narrative of the Second World War through his memoirs, his interviews, and his towering public presence. He had become the voice of Britain's triumph, the man who had refused to bow when all seemed lost. The details of strategy, the quiet struggle inside smoky map rooms, the tense midnight arguments over logistics and manpower, Those faded into the private memories of the officers who had lived them. Alan Brooke watched it happen from the little cottage that overlooked what used to be his own estate. The big house was now owned by another family. Strangers walked the gardens where he had once played as a boy, where he had dreamed of being a soldier, where he had returned after Dunkirk, exhausted but determined to save the army he commanded. Now he lived in a smaller building meant for staff, a reminder of how quickly life shifts after the banners of victory are taken down. He was not bitter in a loud way. Those who visited him remembered him as soft-spoken, courteous, even gentle. But they also remembered something else, an undercurrent of disappointment. Not about Churchill, not about fame or money, but about recognition. He had not wanted statues or parades. He had wanted accuracy. He had wanted his place in the record to match the reality he had lived. He had wanted future generations to understand that wars are not won by speeches alone, but by decisions, sacrifices, compromises, and endless battles behind closed doors. He had wanted the quiet side of victory remembered. Most of all, he had wanted the truth. But the truth is not always what survives. By the early 1960s, Churchill's narrative had become history. His memoirs were taught in schools. His speeches were preserved in anthologies. University students debated his diplomacy and his alliances. And far from the spotlight, Alan Brooke faded. His name appeared in footnotes, if at all. He was cited as Chief of the Imperial General Staff. But his decisions were rarely explained, his warnings rarely quoted, his influence rarely acknowledged. He watched quietly as the war he had helped direct became simplified for public consumption. The messy complexity vanished. The great debates over strategy, North Africa versus Balkans, Italy versus France, Pacific versus Europe, were replaced with a cleaner story. A story of Churchill calling the shots, of America supplying the power, of Russia bleeding Germany dry. It was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete. And history rarely forgives incompleteness. Then, in mid-June of 1963, Alan Francis Brooke, 1st Viscount Alan Brooke, passed away at the age of 79. It was a peaceful passing, the kind that comes at the end of a long life. There were no grand fanfares, no national mourning, no special broadcasts. The obituaries were respectful, but short. Most listed his honors: Field Marshal, Knight of the Garter, Chief of the Imperial General Staff. Few explained what those titles had meant during the war. Few explained that he had once directed the war machine of an empire. Few explained that he had helped shape Allied strategy across the globe. Churchill, by that time, was still alive, still honored, still quoted. His legend had solidified into something almost mythic. The man who had once scribbled ideas at 2 a.m. was now the man who had been right all along. The man who had once been called reckless in private was now the man who had never wavered. The disagreements, the compromises, the times when professionals had to argue for sanity, all faded into the background of public memory. And so Alan Brooke died exactly as he had lived during the war, quietly, professionally, and without claiming the credit he had earned. But here is the twist history loves. Decades later, historians began to re-examine the diaries, not for scandal, but for insight. Scholars reading archival documents at Oxford and Cambridge discovered that Brooke's strategic instincts had often been correct. His warnings about dispersing forces were validated by later military analysis. His objections to Balkan adventures aligned with post-war geopolitical realities. His advocacy for limiting British operations to achievable goals was praised by experts in logistics and strategy. And gradually, a question began to surface in academic circles. a simple question that had gone unanswered for too long. Who actually directed Britain's war? The answer, increasingly, pointed to Brooke. Not alone, not without Churchill, not without the Americans or the Soviets or the commanders in the field, but as the indispensable military mind behind the curtain. The man who balanced resources, weighed risks, and prevented catastrophes. The man who turned Churchill's boundless imagination into practical, lethal reality. The man who understood that the British Army could not be everywhere, that victory required limits as well as ambition. In time, historians would call him one of the finest military strategists of the 20th century. But recognition arrived late. Too late for Brooke to see it. Too late for Churchill to acknowledge it. Too late for the two men to reconcile the bitter wound of 1957. History often does that. It waits until the participants are gone before sorting out who was right, who was wrong, and who was necessary. And that is why the story of Alan Brooke matters today, especially here on WWII Silent Valor, where the hidden corners of the war are brought into the light. Because wars are not just won by speeches or headlines. They are won by sleepless nights, by arguments in map rooms, by decisions nobody hears about, made by people nobody remembers. Before we close, take a second to think about how this story flips the usual script. What other figures might have been lost under louder voices? What other strategies might have been born from conflict instead of unity? And how different would history look if private diaries were never written or never published? If you found this story powerful, surprising, or worth sharing, drop a comment below. Tell us what shocked you most, or whether you think Brooke was justified, or whether Churchill had the right to feel betrayed. And before you swipe to the next video, share this with someone who loves hidden history. They might thank you for it. And of course, hit like and subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive from WWII Silent Valor. Your support keeps stories like this alive.